I didn't plan on making this originally, but season 2 is going to take a while to get through, so here's something to tide you over until then. Death Battle's 7th season is currently on its mid-season break. I've speculated on what's to come. Now let's look back at the episodes we already got. There have been 10 episodes of the season so far, which vary wildly in quality. So which ones are my favorites and which ones use booster gold? I still plan to do a full version of this list when all 20 episodes are out, and this in no way dictates how these 10 will be for sure ordered in that video when it comes around. My opinions on each of these episodes have changed on repeat viewings, and spots 9 through 6 have been rearranged in basically every possible combination, even while I was writing this script. With all that being said, let's start the list off.
But I'm still better than this other guy!
When I saw the preview for Dany vs Jake, I was really worried. I hadn't disliked an episode of Death Battle in almost 2 years, and it would have been really sad if this was the match to break the streak. But the preview looked terrible and my hopes for the episode were really low. Thankfully though, everything after the preview was pretty good, and my streak of liking every episode after Nightwing vs Daredevil wasn't broken. Little did I know I'd only have to wait 2 more weeks. She-Ra vs Wonder Woman is so fucking boring. This isn't Venom vs Bane levels of terrible. It's not even Nightwing vs Daredevil levels of episodes I strongly dislike. It's just one I'm not too fond of. This episode had a lot going against it from the start. It was a DC match with a character making their 3rd appearance, both of which Death Battle has had increasing amounts of lately, and it was the mid-season finale, so it'd have to end things on a high note. It did not. Don't get me wrong, I think the animation quality is overall really good, and there are some enjoyable sword fight scenes, but the fight itself just isn't interesting at all. It's so tame and doesn't do the strength of either character justice. Thor vs Wonder Woman was way better in this regard, since it had them fight in a tornado and blow up the fucking moon. The most that gets destroyed here is a plane and a few trees. The death is really weak as well. Maybe it could have been better if they had Wonder Woman cut an atom in She-Ra's body and that could blow up or something like that. That could have been cool. I'm not gonna ramble on this one for too long. There are still 9 other matches to go over, but this episode really did nothing for me. It's the first 3D fight I've ever disliked and broke Death Battle's 2-year-long good streak in my eyes. Pretty sad that it's Wonder Woman's 3rd episode and her best one is still against Thor. It's a 4 out of 10 for me. I got significantly more enjoyment from people taking the piss out of this awful preview tweet than the episode itself, which is quite sad. Thankfully though, everything else is a 6 or higher.
Such a pretty bird with such an ugly song. Tell me, can you fly?
Black Canary vs Sindel is this season's Ben vs Hal, in the sense that it's the one that's been memed the most among me and my group of friends. Maybe we've memed Booster Gold more, but I actually like the memes surrounding this episode, so there we go. But unlike Ben vs Hal, this one is held back by an aggressively dull match. The episode still ended up being surprisingly decent though. The animation quality was pretty good and the voice actresses delivered most of their lines really well, with only a few exceptions. I really expected the episode where most of the dialogue was screaming to annoy me, but they made it surprisingly tolerable. But of course, the biggest problem I have with this episode is the custom Sindel sprite. It looks so dumb and I hate it. But Boomstick says the funny inside joke, so all is well.
Not gonna lie, Wiz.
Get over yourself!
Dany vs Jake is pretty decent, but it could have been so much more. I really hate the stuff that was shown in the preview on the cast. The sprite rigs look fine in stills, but in motion they make the action feel really janky and stiff. And Dany's mouth looks about as good as season 7 Boomstick's. But the episode really picks up after they leave the museum. The animation quality gets significantly better and the clone versus clone fight was really fun. I like the scene where Dany possesses Jake, and I liked how they put Ghost Jake in at the end. That being said, it still does have some issues, like the ghostly whale feeling like it had very little impact and the death itself being pretty weak. But it's made up for by most of the fight being pretty good, as well as the voice acting being pretty spot on. Especially for Jake, whose voice actress is the first transgender voice actress in Death Battle's history, which is pretty cool. So yeah, the episode is good, but it deserved so much more. It deserved to be fully hand-drawn, but apparently Genesis vs War Machine took priority. It deserved a track with vocals, but apparently that had to go to Grey vs S Death. Oh well.
You look like an idiot.
Okay, let's get this out of the way first.
Reality includes time.
Time, huh? Thanks for the tip.
Doo bitch ass booster gold not being dead last brings me great sadness, but Death Battle just had to go and make this episode fun. Shaking my SMH head. Honestly, I have enough to say about this episode to give it its own solo review, so I'll only talk about it briefly here. But it's a pretty fun episode in spite of the horrendously boring matchup. It would be at least 2 spots higher if Booster said the funny Hal line, but you get what you get and you don't throw a fit.
Thanks for the meal.
With almost every other episode on this list, I've liked them more on repeat watches. Grey vs. S Death is the only one where the opposite is true. What was originally an episode I'd give an 8 or 9 out of 10 has dropped down to a 7. The rigs in the animation look really good, but the actual combat feels really janky at times and the death is pretty lame. Also, the match is one of the ones that interests me least out of the entire season so far, so that makes it harder for me to get into it. Though it is a double-edged sword because apparently the characters are really poorly represented, but I don't know them well enough to notice, nor do I care enough to be bothered by it. It's still an enjoyable episode overall, but not much that stands out for me. This would have been a 6 out of 10, but Lost Ice Storms is one of my favorite tracks in the show's history and single-handedly brought it up to a 7. I've listened to it so many times and I absolutely adore it. I've got more to say about this episode and its track, but those are 2 separate videos for another time.
Ugly. This is my Sunday best.
Genos vs. War Machine has been a real roller coaster of emotions for me. On my first viewing I thought it was decent, but not much more than that. Then after a few rewatches I liked it more and more, to the point of giving it an 8 out of 10 in my review I did of it a month or so ago. But recently I've started to like it a little less because of it being a complete waste of resources. This fight absolutely did not need to be hand-drawn. It's not something I minded originally, but now that I know it directly took the hand-drawn slot away from Dany vs. Jake, it just feels like even more of a waste. Especially since this episode could have worked just fine in sprites. Almost everything else in my review still stands though, and I do still really like the episode. If you want to hear more of my thoughts on this one, then go check out that video. But if you want the TLDR, the animation is really good, the track is good but forgettable, and the end sucks.
I call that the soda touch.
Death Battle rarely hits season premieres out of the park for me, except ironically enough with by far their weakest season overall. Boba vs. Samus was the first episode, so of course it wasn't going to be great. He-Man vs. Lion-O I remember being pretty good but not amazing. Lara vs. Nathan is decent enough. Batman vs. Black Panther is big lame, and Aquaman vs. Namor definitely should have been a few spots lower on my season 6 ranking. And with that, topped with Miles vs. Static being the 3rd Marvel vs. DC premiere in a row, I didn't expect much from it, but it was pretty great. The animation is really well done, and I especially love the use of the puppet rigs that were done way better here than with any other episode of the season. I love how they implemented the shoulder touch, and the rest of their powers are well utilized throughout the rest of the fight. And the track is something else entirely. What's Up Danger sounds like it was pulled directly from the Spider-Verse soundtrack, and I cannot commend it enough. JT Music, Omega Sparks and SWATs all outdone themselves with this track. It's absolutely phenomenal. The episode still has its issues though. For a premiere, it feels really short, and the matchup itself is really uninteresting to me. Season 6 already killed any interest I had in Marvel and DC matches, so for Season 7 to open with Marvel vs. DC fight number 19 wasn't something I was too thrilled about, especially since Miles vs. Deku is a match that I would have actually been pretty excited for. The death was pretty weak as well, and this being the episode to premiere the eldritch horrors that are the Season 7 Wiz and Boomstick designs definitely loses it points. But still, this was a great way to kick off the season.
You're the monster for ruining my pizza.
When Leo vs. Jason got announced, I was basically the only person in my friend group not foaming at the mouth from sheer excitement. Mostly because I'd heard a rumor about one of the characters being on epic rap battles of history before, and it really got my hopes up for Smosh vs. Rhett and Link. But oh well, the episode was still pretty great. It feels like a love letter to old 80s cartoons and games with its retro sound design and kick-ass track. The animation is really well done and the fight remains exciting from beginning to end. I just wish it was a little longer, but I can't complain when we get a short but sweet fight as opposed to an overly long fight that drags a lot. If we want to talk about overly long and dragging, take a look at that track name. Why not just call it Ninja Power? Shaking my SMH head.
Done, huh? Stop saying that!
We had a pretty long gap between the first 3D fight of the season and the last 3D fight of last season. Thankfully the extended wait was worth it. I love Goro vs Machamp so damn much. It's such an entertaining, fast-paced fight that I thoroughly enjoyed from start to finish. It has a level of high-octane energy that a lot of recent 3D fights have lacked. The seismic toss was great. The joke of Goro being frustrated at Machamp only saying his own name was pretty funny. The music was really good and the death was probably the best one of the season so far. The 3D models for this episode were also made from scratch. And the Machamp one is so good that I've seen the majority of people, myself included, mistake it for the official Pokken model. So props to them for that. Pokemon hasn't exactly had a good track record on Death Battle in terms of episode quality, with the only good ones being the ones with the dragon that isn't a dragon. But this episode broke that curse and surpassed any other episode of the show to use a Mortal Kombat or Pokemon character. In terms of negatives, I guess I don't like how Goro's model looks, and they could have used the character's forearms in more unique ways, but the few times they did do that were some pretty great moments. The double dab makes me want to curl up into a ball and die since it almost ruins the seismic toss. And them tearing off each other's arms felt like it had next to no impact since they hardly react to it. Still, those issues don't detract much from my enjoyment of the episode, barring the ones animated by the SFM team. This is my favorite 3D fight we've had in a while. And speaking of the SFM team,
be mindful of your thoughts, ObiWan. They betray you.
Ganon vs Dracula was a great first impression for the SFM animators. It was easily a top tier episode of last season, and I was excited to see them do another episode. And without another Mega Man Battle Royale tier episode to beat it out, Obi-Wan Kenobi vs Kakashi remains uncontested as my favorite episode of this season so far. This episode is really in a league of its own. Everything about it comes together to make not just my favorite episode of these 10, but one that easily makes my top 10 favorites of all time. It's really well animated with some great hand-to-hand segments. The voice actors do great in their roles with the exception of maybe one or two lines. And this is easily the funniest episode of the season. Obi-Wan speaking exclusively in prequel quotes was the only thing I wanted from this episode, and the fact that they actually did it makes me so happy. The 1000 Years of High Ground scene is also top tier. Speaking of top tier, the Genjutsu scene is absolutely phenomenal and is easily one of the best sequences in any episode of Death Battle. There's no way it couldn't make the top of this list with that alone. What can I even say in terms of negatives? I guess the death scene could have held on this shot a little longer to create more suspense. And there is a little bit of jank. But even Snake vs Sam has some of that, so it's not a deal breaker for me. Other than that, this is a near perfect episode of Death Battle. While it's a shame that this season gave us the first episode I disliked since Mario vs Sonic, I also have to commend it for giving us the first episode since then that I preferred over it. And I can't wait to see what the SFM team does for their next episode. With the right match, Snake vs Sam might just have some real competition for the title of my favorite episode. And that's my ranking of season 7 so far. I will be doing a full ranking of all 20 episodes when the season ends. So I'm looking forward to what the rest of the season has in store. Who knows? Maybe there will be an episode I like even more than Obi-Wan vs Kakashi. That episode is currently sitting as my number 5 favorite of all time. So it'll be a hard one to top. But they just might be able to surpass it if they do All for One versus the Annihilator like we've all been hoping for. As for what my next video is gonna be on, maybe I'll finally get around to my season 2 ranking. Or maybe I'll give the people what they want and do my hour-long analysis on Cable versus Booster Gold.